The air in the Grand Viennese concert hall was thick with the smell of old wood, polished brass, and expensive perfume. It was the sound of success, and to the young man at the center of the room, it was his favorite perfume. Let's call him Leo. Leo was a pianist, and not just any pianist. At 28, he was being called a virtuoso, a prodigy, a force of nature. His fingers, long and restless, were his weapons, and the piano was the battlefield where he won his wars. Tonight's war had been Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. He hadn't just played it. He had attacked it. He had made the thundering passages sound like avalanches, the delicate runs like a torrential downpour of diamonds. The final crashing chords had been so powerful, they seemed to shake the dust from the crystal chandeliers. The audience had leaped to their feet, a roaring wave of sound that washed over him as he took his bow, a lock of dark hair falling over his forehead, a confident, slightly exhausted smile on his lips. Now, in the gilded reception room, the victory felt even sweeter. He held a delicate flute of champagne, not really drinking it, but using it as a prop. He moved through the crowd like a prince, accepting praise with a practiced nod, a humble tilt of the head that wasn't humble at all. Astonishing power, young man, breathed an elderly gentleman with a waxed mustache. Thank you. One tries to do justice to the maestro's storm, Leo replied, his voice a smooth baritone. A society woman in a sapphire dress touched his arm. I've never heard the octaves played so fast. It must be incredibly difficult. It requires a certain discipline, Leo said, allowing a hint of a smirk. He loved these conversations. They were part of the performance. He saw his manager across the room, giving him a discreet thumbs up. Record deals, European tours, it was all unfolding exactly as planned. Leo felt invincible, a king in a kingdom of black and white keys. Then, a different kind of presence approached. She was a small, older Japanese woman, standing quietly at the edge of the circle that had formed around him. She was perhaps in her 60s, with a serene, unlined face and hair swept into a simple, elegant knot. She wore a charcoal gray dress, understated and perfect. She didn't push forward. She simply waited until the chatter died down for a moment. Her calmness was a contrast to the buzzing energy around him. Leo, feeling generous in his triumph, turned to her with his performer's smile. Did you enjoy the concert? He asked, the question almost a formality. She gave a small, polite bow. Thank you for your performance. It was very energetic. Her voice was soft, with a gentle accent that made each word precise. Leo's smile widened. Energetic. He'd been called explosive, brilliant, transcendent. Energetic was a new one. It sounded like something you'd say about a puppy. The ballade is a passionate piece, he said, a slight defensive note entering his voice. It requires a certain fire. Yes, she agreed, her dark eyes meeting his. They were calm, observant pools. Fire is important, but so is the space for the smoke to clear. I felt, perhaps, you could consider the ma more. Leo blinked. The what? Ma, she repeated. It is the space between things, the pause, the silence that gives shape to the sound. In your playing, the notes were all very close together, like a crowded room. There was little room to breathe, for the listener or for the music itself. A sudden, hot flush crept up the back of Leo's neck. The people around them had gone quiet, listening. This wasn't praise. This was a critique, from a nobody in a gray dress. He felt his triumph curdle into something sharp and prickly. He forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. Well, Chopin wasn't exactly known for his silence, was he? It's a romantic piece. It's about emotion. Grand emotion. He said the words slowly, as if explaining something to a child. The woman, whom someone would later murmur was named Aiko, didn't look offended. She simply nodded again, that infuriatingly placid look on her face. The grandest emotion often lives in the quietest moment. The grief between the sobs. This was too much. The crowd was watching, waiting to see how the star would handle this unexpected challenge. Leo's ego, tender and inflated from the night's applause, felt punctured. He needed to regain control. He needed to put this gentle critic in her place, but with the grace of a winner, he took a sip of his champagne, buying a second to think. Then, an idea came to him, a funny, charming, public way to end this. He set his glass down on a nearby table with a deliberate click. "You speak about the music with such feeling," he said, his voice taking on a theatrical, playful tone. He spread his hands, addressing the small audience that had gathered. It's always so valuable to hear from a fellow enthusiast. He saw a few people smile. Good, they were with him. He turned his full attention back to the woman. Aiko. His eyes twinkled with mischievous condescension. You know, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. Perhaps it's better to simply play. He let the word hang in the air. The piano here in the hall is still open. Perhaps you should show me what you mean? A little demonstration? He gestured grandly toward the door that led back to the main hall. A titter of excited laughter ran through the crowd. This was getting interesting. A post-concert showdown. Leo leaned in, lowering his voice to a stage whisper that everyone could still hear. What do you say? A friendly little duel? You can show me all about this. Ma. He couldn't keep a faint, teasing edge from the foreign word. He expected many things. He expected her to blush and demur. He expected her to laugh it off. He expected her to make an excuse and slip away into the crowd. That would have been the end of it. He would have been the generous, if slightly cheeky, victor offering a chance to a fan dot. He did not expect what happened next. Aiko looked at him, her head tilted slightly. For the first time, her serene expression changed. A flicker passed through her eyes, something deep, unreadable. It wasn't fear. It wasn't embarrassment. It was more like recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time without ever knowing it. The room held its breath. The society woman in blue stopped fanning herself. The old man with the mustache adjusted his monocle. Then, Aiko Tanaka gave one more small, graceful bow. It was deeper than her previous ones. It was a bow of acceptance. If you wish, she said, her soft voice suddenly clear as a bell in the silent room. I would be honored. And just like that, the ground shifted under Leo's feet. The playful challenge was no longer a game. It was real. A cold trickle of doubt, the first he'd felt all evening, seeped into his stomach. He had thrown down a gauntlet without looking, and to his utter shock, someone had picked it up. The confident smile on his face felt suddenly stiff, painted on. The night's victory, so solid moments ago, now felt fragile. The duel was on. The news, as such things do, spread through the musical circles of Vienna not like a wildfire, but like a slow, curious mine. A concert pianist had challenged an elderly Japanese lady to an impromptu piano duel. It was too strange, too charming, not to share. By the following afternoon, word had reached the conservatories, the coffee houses where students argued over composers, and the quiet apartments of retired music teachers. The result was, when Leo walked back into the concert hall, he was met not with an empty room for a private lesson, but with a quiet, expectant audience of perhaps 60 people. His stomach gave a small, unpleasant twist. This was more attention than he'd bargained for. He had imagined a swift, almost paternal demonstration of his superiority, a gentle correction for the woman Aiko, and then maybe a coffee, where he would generously explain his interpretative choices. This felt different. This felt like a contest. The hall was bathed in the pale, dusty gold of afternoon light, a stark contrast to the dramatic evening shadows of his performance. The piano, a magnificent black concert grand, sat center stage like a sleeping beast. People sat in small clusters, talking in hushed, excited tones. He saw his manager near the back, talking urgently on the phone, probably trying to spin this into some kind of promotional opportunity. And there, in the front row, sat Aiko. She was as still as she had been the night before, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple cream-colored blouse and a dark skirt. She looked like she was waiting for a lecture to begin, not preparing to step onto a battlefield. Leo took a deep breath, pushing down the flutter of nerves. This was his world. This stage, this instrument. He was in his element. He strode down the aisle, giving a few familiar faces a confident nod. He stepped up onto the stage, the familiar creak of the floorboards under his feet a comfort. "Well," he said, his voice echoing a little in the high ceiling. He meant it to sound warm and casual. This turned into a bit of a party, didn't it? A light, nervous laugh rippled through the room. We agreed on a little friendly exchange, to share our different perspectives on the music. He turned to Aiko, offering a stage smile. "As the challenger," he said, emphasizing the word to make it sound like a joke, "perhaps you would like to set the terms? Or shall I?" Aiko looked up at him. "You are the host," she said simply. "Please set the terms." Her calmness was unnerving. Leo had expected some hesitation, some negotiation. Her immediate deference put the weight back on him. He cleared his throat. "Very well. Let's keep it simple. We both play the same piece. The one we discussed. The Chopin Ballade. Then, well, let the music speak for itself." He didn't want to say winner or loser. This was about artistic dialogue, he told himself. Aiko gave a single slow nod of agreement. A fine choice. And as the one who performed it publicly last night, Leo continued, feeling his confidence surge back, "I suppose it's only fair I go first. To, set the stage." What he didn't say was that he wanted to establish the standard. He wanted to dazzle the room so completely that anything following would sound like an echo, a faint copy. Aiko nodded again. "Of course." Leo turned to the piano. He took off his jacket, draped it carefully over the bench, and sat down. He took a moment, stretching his fingers, feeling the cool ivory of the keys. This was his territory. He launched into a brief, flashy etude as a warm-up, his fingers flying in a blur of precision. The notes were sharp, brilliant, and technically flawless. It was a message? *C? This is the level we are playing at. He stopped, let the last note fade, and took a deeper, more theatrical breath. He placed his hands over the opening chords of the ballade. He thought of Aiko's words. Ma, the space between. He deliberately pushed the thought away. This piece was a torrent, a tsunami. You didn't put space in a tsunami? You wrote it. He began, and it was, by any standard, a magnificent performance. Perhaps even better than the night before. Fueled by a new, competitive energy, he attacked the keyboard with even more ferocity. The crashing octaves were like hammer blows. The rapid, descending runs were perfect cascades of sound, every note distinct and powerful. He poured everything into it, all his training, all his desire to prove himself, all his need to win this unspoken competition. He was a warrior, and this was his war cry. He swayed with the music, his body a conduit for the emotion. In the passionate sections, he was all fury and fire. In the lyrical moments, he was soulful, almost tender. It was a full-body, full-volume interpretation. He didn't leave a single moment empty, a single emotion unexpressed. He filled the hall, every corner of it, with the sound of Leo. When he struck the final, devastating chords, the effect was immediate. The small audience erupted. They cheered, they whistled, they stood up. It was a roaring, overwhelming wave of approval. He sat for a second, panting slightly, sweat on his brow, absorbing the adulation. He turned on the bench, looking out at the standing ovation, and let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. He searched for Aiko in the front row. She was clapping. Politely, softly. Her face was still that mask of serene attention. She didn't look overwhelmed. She didn't look intimidated. She looked prepared. A sliver of ice, thin and sharp, went through Leo's heart. The applause, which had felt so warm a second ago, suddenly felt loud and hollow. His performance, which had felt so complete, now felt strangely exposed, as if he had shown all his cards in the first hand. He stood, took a bow, and gestured with a flourish toward Aiko. "And now," he said, his voice a little hoarse from the effort, "I believe it is your turn." The applause died down into a thick, anticipatory silence. The audience settled back into their seats, but the energy was different now. They weren't just curious anymore. They were braced. Leo had thrown down a gauntlet of sound, a performance so powerful it seemed to leave the air vibrating. What could possibly follow that? Leo walked to the side of the stage and leaned against the piano, crossing his arms. He tried to look supportive, avuncular, the master observing the student. Aiko stood. She walked up the 3 steps to the stage with a quiet, unhurried grace. She did not acknowledge the audience. She went straight to the piano. She looked at the bench, still pushed back from Leo's vigorous performance. She gently adjusted it, lowering it slightly. She sat. And then she did nothing. She simply placed her hands in her lap and looked at the keyboard. 5 seconds passed. 10. The silence in the hall grew deeper, heavier. People shifted in their seats. Leo's supportive smile began to feel stiff. What was she doing? Was she nervous? Was she forgetting how it started? He was about to say something, to offer a helpful prompt, when she finally moved. Slowly, with a kind of deliberate care, she raised her hands and placed them on the keys. Not in the dramatic, hovering pose Leo used, but gently, as if feeling the temperature of the instrument. She settled her fingers, took a breath so quiet it was almost inaudible, and then looked down, her gaze turning inward. The hall was utterly, profoundly silent. The kind of silence that has weight. Then she played the first note. It wasn't a note, as Leo understood it. It was a sound that seemed to bloom from the heart of the piano itself. It wasn't loud, but it was incredibly present. It was clear, round, and warm, and it hung in the silent air of the hall, not like an attack, but like a question. Leo felt the blood drain from his face. His arms, crossed over his chest, tightened. She played the second note, and then the third. They were connected by that silence she had spoken of, the ma, but it wasn't empty space. It was alive. It was the space where the ghost of the previous note lived, and the anticipation for the next one grew. Her tempo was slower than his, deliberate. It wasn't hesitant. It was spacious. As she moved into the first stirrings of the melody, Leo stopped hearing notes and started hearing a story. A story told in whispers and sighs, with pauses so deep you could fall into them. Her touch was a miracle of control. Each key was pressed with a precise weight, creating a sound that was neither weak nor brutal, but perfectly, heartbreakingly human. She hadn't even reached the first turbulent passage, and Leo already knew. The ice in his heart turned into a cold, sinking stone. His mouth went dry. He had been so wrong. This was no duel. He hadn't challenged a fan. He had, with his own foolish pride, summoned a master. The cold stone in Leo's stomach grew heavier with every note. He stood frozen against the side of the piano, his arms still crossed, but now the pose felt like a shield, not a sign of confidence. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. It was like watching a car accident in slow motion, beautiful and terrifying all at once. The first theme, which he had played with such bold, romantic yearning, unfolded from Aiko's fingers as a memory. It was fragile, tinged with a sadness so deep it didn't need to shout. Her left hand, playing the accompaniment, wasn't just chords. It was a heartbeat, a soft pulse under the skin of the melody. Where Leo had filled every moment with sound, Aiko let the phrases breathe. She would play a group of notes, and then there was that space, the meow. In that silence, the music didn't stop. It echoed in the listener's mind. It grew. It changed meaning. The silence was as much a part of the music as the sound. Leo's mind, trained for over 20 years, began to tear itself apart. One part was the stunned audience member, feeling a lump form in his throat at the sheer beauty of it. The other part was the competitive pianist, screaming technical analysis. Her fingering is all wrong for that run, the technician in him hissed. Asterisk, she's using her fifth finger where she should pivot with her thumb. It's inefficient. Asterisk, but then she played the run, and the sound was a seamless, liquid whisper, like water over smooth stones. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about sound. Only sound. The tempo is too slow, the technician argued. Chopin's markings suggest more motion here, but as she held back, the tension built in a way Leo had never felt. When she finally allowed the music to surge forward, it wasn't a burst of energy. It was a release of something that had been aching to break free. It felt inevitable, true. He watched her hands. They were not young hands. There were fine lines, the veins slightly raised. They moved without flourish, without the athletic leaps his own made. They were economical, almost spare in their movement. Yet from that minimal motion came a sound of unimaginable richness. It was as if she wasn't striking the keys, but persuading the strings inside the piano to sing of their own accord. The tone was neither bright nor dark. It was clear, like looking into deep water, and it carried through the hall with a presence that his louder playing had never achieved. His sound had hit the back wall. Hers seemed to soak into the very wood of the hall. The audience was absolutely still. No one coughed. No one shuffled. They were leaning forward, some with their mouths slightly open, others with eyes closed, as if praying. The society woman from the night before had a single tear tracing a path through her powder. Leo felt his own defenses, brick by brick, begin to crumble. The smugness was gone, burned away by a hot shame. The confidence was shattered, replaced by a dawning, horrible understanding. This was a language he had studied for years, but had never truly learned to speak. He knew the grammar, the notes, the rhythms, the dynamics. But she understood the poetry. She understood the soul of it. The music approached the first great storm, the section where Leo had unleashed his thunder. He braced himself, waiting for her to pull back, to soften it. She didn't, but her storm was different. It wasn't a hurricane from the outside. It was an earthquake from within. The power was there, immense and frightening, but it was controlled. Every crashing chord had shape, clarity. You could hear the individual voices within the chaos. It wasn't noise. It was fate roaring. And in the middle of the fury, she would find a single line of melody and let it sing through the tumult like a voice crying in the wind. Leo had played this section as a conquering hero. She played it as a survivor. He found himself breathing with her phrasing. He was no longer a critic or a rival. Against his will, he had become a follower, pulled into the world she was creating. He thought of his own performance just minutes before. It now seemed like a brilliant, colorful cartoon compared to an old master's painting. All the lines were there, but his had no depth, no shadow, no life behind the eyes. The most painful part was the realization of her generosity the night before. Her comment about the ma hadn't been a criticism from an amateur. It had been a lifeline thrown by a master to a drowning sailor. A single, simple clue to a deeper truth. And he had mocked it. He had used it as a reason to challenge her. The shame burned in his cheeks. He wanted to sink into the floorboards. The ballad moved into its final desperate pages. This was the lament, the cry of ultimate loss. Leo had played this with dramatic sorrow, a public grief. Aiko's playing grew even quieter, even more focused. The notes were like footsteps in an empty house. The famous, heartbreaking descending passage wasn't a melodic line. It was a sigh that turned into a sob that had no tears left. She made the piano sound hushed, intimate, as if she were playing for one person in the vast, silent hall. When the final, abrupt G minor chord came, she didn't attack it. She placed it. It was a sound of finality, not a slam of a door, but the soft, heavy click of a lid closing. Then, true silence. It was deeper than before. It was a silence full of the music that had just ended. For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The spell was too complete to break. Leo, from his place by the piano, saw the faces in the front row. They were stunned, as if waking from a powerful dream. The elderly professor, beside his manager, had removed his glasses and was pressing his fingers to his closed eyes. Then, it broke. It wasn't an explosion of applause like his had been. It was a slow, rising wave. It started with a single person clapping, slowly, with deep respect. Then another joined. Then the whole room was on its feet, not cheering, but applauding with a steady, profound intensity. It was the kind of applause that isn't for entertainment, but for recognition, for witnessing something rare and true. Aiko sat at the piano, her head still bowed slightly. She seemed unaware of the audience, still caught in the world of the music. Then, slowly, she lifted her hands from the keys and placed them back in her lap. She took a small, quiet breath and stood up. She turned to the audience and gave a small, humble bow, not from the waist like a performer, but a slight incline of her head and shoulders. A gesture of thanks, not triumph. Her eyes met Leo's as she straightened. In that moment, he saw no gloating. No, I told you so. He saw only the same serene calm from the reception, but now he understood it. It wasn't emptiness. It was depth. It was the peace that comes from having nothing to prove, because you know absolutely who you are and what your music is. The applause continued, washing over her, over him, over the piano that had just spoken a truth he could barely comprehend. He was still leaning against the instrument, but his body felt limp. The duel was over. There were no points to tally, no judges to consult. The verdict was in the air, in the tears on faces, in the shaking hands of the old professor, now struggling to his feet, and in the cold, hollow space where Leo's pride used to be. He had challenged her to show him what Ma was. Now, in the ringing silence after her final note, he finally understood. And he wished, with every fiber of his being, that he didn't. The applause was a physical thing, a warm, rolling pressure that filled the hall. But for Leo, standing stiffly by the piano, it felt cold and distant, like hearing a storm from inside a thick glass jar. He watched as Aiko, with another modest incline of her head, stepped away from the piano. She did not look at him again. Instead, she moved toward the steps to leave the stage, but she never made it. The small audience surged forward. They weren't a mob, but a tide of reverence. They surrounded her at the edge of the stage, their voices a low, excited hum. The elderly professor, who had been sitting with Leo's manager, was one of the first to reach her. He took her hand in both of his own hands trembling slightly. "Madame," he said, his voice choked. "It wasn't the madam you use for a stranger. It was the madame of deep respect. Forgive me. I must ask. Your touch. That particular clarity in the tenor register. It is a sound I have not heard in 50 years. Not since I was a boy in Paris. You studied with him, didn't you? With the old master?" Leo, straining to hear over the buzzing in his own ears, caught the words. Asterisk Paris? Old master? He took a half-step closer, his own shame momentarily buried under a wave of desperate curiosity. Aiko looked at the old professor, and for the first time, a real, warm smile touched her eyes, softening her serene face. It was a smile of shared memory. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I was very young, and very fortunate, he was. Very strict about the sound. He would say the piano must speak, not shout. The professor let out a breath that was almost a sob of joy. I knew it. I heard him play once, just once, in a small salon. It was the same principle. Not the notes, but the speech between them. You are a guardian of that. I thought that understanding was lost. Other people pressed in, asking quiet questions. A conservatory student, her eyes wide. How do you practice for that kind of tone control? An older woman, a patron of the arts. That was the most profound musical experience of my life. Aiko answered them all quietly, without pretension. She spoke of listening, of patience, of treating the piano as a partner, not a tool. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Leo's manager, a practical man with a keen eye for opportunity, appeared at his side. He was not looking at Leo. He was staring at Aiko with the intensity of a prospector who had just found a gold mine. "Do you have any idea who that is?" He whispered, his voice tight with excitement. "That's not just some old lady. She's a direct link. A student of one of the last great pianists of the old European school. The ones who learned from the people who learned from Liszt, for God's sake. This isn't a duel, Leo. This is history walking in. We need to talk to her. Recordings, master classes." His manager's words buzzed around Leo's head like flies. They meant nothing. All he could feel was the vast, yawning gap that had opened up between what he thought he was and what he now saw he was. He had been climbing a tall, shiny ladder, proud of his speed, looking down at those below. And in one afternoon, he had glanced up and seen that his ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. Aiko wasn't even on a ladder. She was standing on solid ground, on a mountain he hadn't known existed. The crowd around Aiko began to slowly move, escorting her off the stage and up the aisle as if she were a precious relic. Leo found his feet moving, following at a distance, pulled along in their wake. He was a ghost in his own disaster. In the lobby, under the grand chandelier, the scene continued. The professor was talking animatedly to a small group, waving his hands. She doesn't perform publicly. Not for decades. She teaches, privately, somewhere in Kyoto. She is here visiting a former student, I heard. A fluke, a miracle. Kyoto. A teacher. The pieces snapped together with cruel clarity. She hadn't been a fan seeking an autograph. She had been a master, observing a talented but misguided pupil. And he had thrown a gauntlet at her feet. The group around Aiko began to thin, people reluctantly pulling on coats, still throwing glances of awe back at her. Finally, Leo saw his moment. Or perhaps he just ran out of space to hide. He approached her. She was alone now, smoothing the sleeve of her cream blouse. She looked up as he neared. Her expression was unreadable, calm as a forest pool. The words he had prepared clever, Gracious, face-saving words turned to ash in his mouth. All that came out was a raw, quiet statement. I had no idea. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession of his own blindness. Aiko studied him for a moment. She saw the shattered pride, the confusion, the dawning horror in his young face. Her gaze was not unkind. It was the look of someone who has seen this before. The moment a talented person encounters a truth larger than their talent. You play very well, she said, and he could tell she meant it. There was no irony. Your technique is exceptional. It is a magnificent engine. The word engine hung in the air. Powerful, mechanical, meant for a purpose. But an engine, she continued softly, does not know where it is going. It only knows how to run. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look through him into the frantic, striving place he called his ambition. You asked me about Ma. It is not just silence in the music. It is silence in the player, the quiet inside that allows you to listen, to hear what the music wants to be, not what you want to make of it. Leo stood there, hollowed out. He felt like a beautifully crafted violin that had just realized it was full of sawdust. He had nothing to say. Every argument, every defense, had been obliterated by the sound of her playing. What? What do I do? The question escaped him, weak and small. He hated the sound of it, the neediness. But it was all he had left. Aiko's smile returned, gentle. You have a great gift. A fast car. Now you must learn the road, not just the map. She glanced toward the hall, where the piano sat silent. You must listen for the messages in the quiet. They are the only ones that matter. She gave him one last, slight nod, a teacher dismissing a student after a difficult but important lesson. Then she turned and walked toward the entrance, where the elderly professor was waiting to escort her out. She did not look back. Leo watched her go, a small, elegant figure disappearing into the late afternoon light of Vienna. The lobby was empty now. The echoes of the applause, the murmur of the crowd were gone. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the frantic, shameful beat of his own heart. His manager clapped a hand on his shoulder, making him jump. Okay, don't worry about this. It's a great story. The young lion humbled by the hidden master. It's humanizing. We can use this. I'll reach out to her people. See if we can arrange a joint interview, maybe, eh? Leo shrugged the hand off. He couldn't bear it. The idea of turning this cataclysm into a promotional story made him feel sick. No, he said, his voice rough. Don't. He walked away from his manager, back toward the empty stage. He needed to be alone with the instrument that had witnessed his folly. The piano sat there, a dark, knowing presence. He approached it, running a finger along its polished lid. He had thought he commanded it. Now he wondered if it had just been tolerating him. He sat on the bench Aiko had used. It was still at her lower height. He didn't adjust it. He placed his hands on the keys where hers had been. He played a single note dot. It sounded loud, harsh, and empty. The single note Leo played hung in the empty hall, a stark, lonely sound that faded into a silence that felt different now. It was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a presence. It was the silence Aiko had left behind, and it was full of everything he did not know. For a long time, he just sat there on the low bench, his hands in his lap, staring at the keyboard. The proud, polished instrument looked back at him, a stranger. All the familiar landmarks, the slight chip on middle C, the way the light caught the ebony sharp seemed alien. This was no longer his weapon, his trophy. It was a door. And he had just realized he didn't have the key. His manager's words about a great story and humanizing echoed, tinny and hollow. He felt like a piece of clay that had been smashed flat, and someone was trying to call the cracks a new pattern. He couldn't go back to being that person, the one who strutted and smirked and thought speed was the same as depth. That person felt dead. The problem was, there was no one else to be. He left the hall as the cleaning staff arrived, their quiet murmurs and the squeak of their carts feeling like an intrusion. The Vienna streets were busy with evening life, couples laughing, trams clattering, but to Leo it was all a blur of noise. He walked without direction, the cold air sharp in his lungs. He kept hearing that single perfect note from the beginning of Aiko's performance, the one that had bloomed. His own, just minutes ago, had just sounded. He ended up at a small, quiet cafe he knew, tucked away from the main avenues. He sat in a corner, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He replayed the entire awful sequence in his head. The reception, his smug challenge, his brilliant performance, and then her. The memory of her music didn't feel like a defeat anymore. It felt like a relocation. He had been lost in a small, brightly lit room, thinking it was the whole world. She had opened a door to a vast, dark, beautiful landscape he never knew was there. A week later, he was supposed to fly to Berlin for the next concert of his tour. A prestigious hall, a sold-out crowd. He stood in his apartment, the itinerary on his desk, and felt a physical wave of nausea. The thought of walking out on another stage, bowing, and then filling another hall with that magnificent engine of sound made his skin crawl. It would be a lie. He would be pretending nothing had happened. He picked up the phone. His manager's reaction was a predictable storm of panic and logic. This is career suicide. You have contracts. This is a moment, Leo, a bump in the road. You play through it. But for the first time, Leo didn't care about the road everyone else had mapped for him. Cancel it, he said, his voice quieter but firmer than it had ever been. Cancel everything. For the next 3 months. I'll pay the penalties. There was a long, furious silence on the other end. What are you going to do? His manager finally asked, his tone icy. I don't know, Leo said honestly. I need to be quiet. He spent the first week in a kind of paralysis. He avoided his piano. He listened to music, but it was agony. He could hear the striving in every performer, the ghosts of his own ambitions. He listened to old, scratchy recordings the professor had mentioned, pianists from a century ago. Their sound was different, less perfect, but more human. He began to hear, faintly, what the old man had been talking about. After 2 weeks of this restless emptiness, he finally approached his piano again. Not to play Chopin or Liszt or any of his war horses. He sat down and played a C major scale, slowly, one note at a time. He focused on making the transition from one finger to the next seamless. He tried to make each note have the same warm, round quality. It was shockingly difficult. His fingers, trained for velocity and power, wanted to snap and jump. He had to fight 20 years of muscle memory. He spent days on scales, then on simple chords, listening to how the notes blended, how the sound decayed. He was not practicing. He was exploring. He was, as Aiko had said, learning to listen. The silence between the notes became a place of work, of anticipation, not something to be feared and filled. He reached out to a few older teachers, not for lessons in the normal sense, but for conversation. He asked them about sound, about touch, about the old schools of playing. One of them, a retired man with gentle eyes, watched him try to produce a simple melody. You are pushing the sound out, the old teacher said. You must let the sound come to you. It is inside the piano. You are just inviting it. It was a frustrating, humbling process. There were days he wanted to scream, to smash his fists on the keys, and play a thunderous Rachmaninoff concerto, just to feel powerful again. But the memory of that afternoon in the hall held him back. The memory of the cold stone in his stomach was a better teacher than any compliment had ever been. He began to take long walks. He visited museums and looked at paintings, not for culture, but to see how the artists used space, how a blank part of the canvas held as much meaning as the brushstrokes. He sat in parks and just listened to the city, trying to pick out individual sounds from the tapestry of noise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something inside him began to change. The frantic, desperate energy that had fueled his playing began to settle. The need to be the best, the fastest, the most dramatic started to lose its grip. It was replaced by a deeper, more patient curiosity. He wasn't getting better. He was getting different. After 2 months, he tentatively opened the score of the Chopin Ballade. It was like reading a letter in a language he was only beginning to understand. He saw not just the notes, but the spaces around them. He saw the architecture, the story. He tried to play a few lines. It was terrible. Clumsy, halting, full of pauses that felt awkward, not profound. But for the first time, he wasn't trying to conquer it. He was trying to understand it. He never tried to contact Aiko Tanaka. He felt that would be another kind of presumption, another demand on a master who had already given him the only thing that mattered, a direction. Her gift was not a solution, but a question. And he was finally learning how to live inside it. The 3-month mark came and went. His manager called, cautiously. The Berlin Hall has an opening in 6 weeks. They're willing to reconsider. What do you want to do? Leo looked at his piano. He thought about the vast, quiet landscape. He was still standing at the edge of it, a beginner. The thought of Berlin, of that same sold-out hall, still filled him with a kind of dread. He wasn't ready. He might never be ready for that again, in the same way. I'm not doing the tour, he said. But maybe a small concert. Somewhere. Smaller. Quieter. There was a pause on the line. That's not how careers are built, Leo. I know, Leo said. I'm not building that career anymore. The small concert was arranged in a chapel attached to an old music school. The audience was maybe 100 people. There was no buzz, no pretense. When Leo walked out, he didn't stride. He simply came to the piano and sat. He felt nervous, but it was a clean nervousness, not the fear of failing to impress. He played a different program. Simpler pieces. Some Schubert impromptus, a late Beethoven bagatelle. He played them slowly, carefully, listening for the sound, for the story in the spaces. It wasn't a perfect performance. There were hesitations, moments where the old, flashy technique tried to break through, and he had to pull it back. It was raw and real, an utterly human. When he finished, the applause was warm, thoughtful. It wasn't a roaring triumph. It was recognition of a shared journey. An older woman came up to him afterwards, her eyes soft. Thank you, she said. That felt true. It was the greatest compliment he had ever received. Leo knew he was at the very beginning. The road Aiko had hinted at was long, and he had only taken a few shaky steps. He still had the technique, the fast car, but now he was looking for the road, not on any map. He was listening for it. In the quiet between the notes, in the silence after the music, in the simple, honest sound of a single, well-played chord. He had challenged a woman to a duel and lost everything he thought mattered. And in that empty space, he had finally found the music.